Many of our compatriots, and almost all ordinary people, are firmly convinced of the creative role of entrepreneurship and the absence of exploitation in a modern civilized and democratic society. At the same time, they frivolously attribute the numerous negative results of interaction with the wage labor system in their personal lives to the arbitrariness of their superiors, low wages, crisis phenomena, depreciation of the exchange rate, visitors, macroeconomic problems, and so on, up to chronic bad luck. Especially such ideas are rooted in the environment of people who are not directly engaged in productive work, who do not see the alienation of the material embodiment of their work. Not only employees do not notice exploitation, the majority of the population often have little idea what capitalism and capitalist exploitation are. Meanwhile, it is well known that the feudal lords exploited serfs, forcing them to work or demanding the gratuitous transfer of manufactured products. The vast majority of modern people recognize this kind of relationship between landowners and workers as outright barbarism. In this case, serfdom, like slavery, acts as a visual illustration of the cannibalistic nature of private property relations between a narrow group that has usurped rights and all factors of production through state coercion by the rest of the people, forced to work for it or pay off. One must think that the difference between cannibalism and exploitation is only that in the second case, the bloodsucker absorbs not the flesh of the victim, but the priceless time of her life, killing her not instantly, but with severe daily torments under the guise of difficult life circumstances. However, there is absolutely no understanding in the public consciousness that wage labor is a veiled form of the same slavery and serfdom. Wage labor in the truest sense of the word is a form of cannibalism. The realization of this truth is usually hindered not only by the ocean of bourgeois propaganda, broadcasting about the beneficial nature and effectiveness of the market, private property, entrepreneurship, money circulation, investments, and so on, in which the entire capitalist world has been arriving since the middle of the 19th century, but also by the fact that the appropriation of labor results occurs not only in favor of the direct employer, but also indirectly to the entire class of owners of means of production. That is, each employee is exploited by a considerable number of capitalists in one volume or another, through millions of threads of the global economy. Have you received your salary? So the results of your work have brought bankers, financiers, merchants, industrialists, electric, automotive, metallurgical, machine building, meat, chocolate, and the like kings and magnates, as well as average and average capitalists' surplus value. What path the results of our labor in the form of goods and services take in the market, how the monetary profit is distributed for us as employers, does not matter at all. In one case, it is a short path and a chain consisting of only a dozen links, and in another covering several continents. Wages are not wages earned for labor, not monetary remuneration, but the minimum amount of money necessary for the reproduction of labor. In short, a handout for survival and continued hard work to the grave. Salary is a form of alienation of a direct or indirect producer from the results of labor. Of course, they can say here that there is a meager salary and there are large salaries. The fact is that the above brief definition reveals the essence of wages in general. Wages as a form of social relations under capitalism. This means that if one employer receives a higher salary than another, if we omit the wage difference associated with the need to reproduce highly qualified workers, based on the cost of training and skills acquisition, then as a rule, this happens at the expense of the mass of low-paid proletarians. Entrepreneurs never share their income voluntarily. They reduce the maintenance and salary of some proletarians in 1,000 ways if they need to encourage others. This is what happens with salaries in highly profitable areas, energy, oil and gas, and so on. This is what happens in fashionable and bourgeois professions in pop, design, PR, economic and legal specialties. That is, somewhere in the province, 3 skins are torn from you, so that 1.5 are torn in the capital, not to mention 100 skins that are lowered from migrants in all regions. The bourgeoisie, especially the largest, the oligarchy, as a whole, not only does not divide, but also never strains or suffers. She always bathes in luxury, lives in idleness, despises the people and surrounds herself with vile actors. The rich don't cry, at least not really, the same bitter tears that they cause billions of proletarians around the world to shed every day. Awareness of the existence and essence of exploitation is also hindered by the well-known appearance of voluntary wage labor. After all, formally, an employee is endowed with the same civil right as a businessman, and voluntarily enters into a deal to sell the labor force product, which is all he has. And if you read textbooks on economics, then an idyllic picture emerges. 2 equal gentlemen meet in the labor market, one with money, the other has work skills and free time. so they conclude a mutually beneficial deal in the form of hiring. That's what they tell the kids at the institutes today. It is not difficult to notice that several nuances are overlooked. The first, where does the employer get the money from? Second, why is a worker forced to get a job? Third, why does the amount of salary not depend on the degree of social usefulness of his work? Why can't an employee claim the results of their work, unlike an investor? Even more rhetorical questions await the younger readers of economics textbooks when they go to be hired by an entrepreneur in real life, when they have to turn around in an effort to please the employer at interviews, endure sophisticated humiliations from him, complete indifference to the comfort and safety of working conditions, violation of all kinds of rights, moral and ethical norms, in short, when they have to feel on their own skin that a working person for a businessman is nothing more than an appendage of the profit production process, a string costs in management and accounting. Before starting to prepare a draft, it would be nice for writers of bourgeois textbooks on economics to send their families to work in a mine, a construction site, a sawmill or an assembly line for a couple of years, so that they write about the capitalist economy, having deeply felt wage labor. However, such occupational therapy will not correct some liberals. It may seem that the severity of executive, monotonous, physical labor is inherent not in capitalism, but in the production process itself, technologically hampered by the complexity of converting natural material. They say that working as a miner is not sweet under both capitalism and socialism. Adherents of the market cunningly preach that smart, brave, hard-working and successful people do not get into miners. To engage in hard, stultifying, dangerous work is the fate of the worst human material. If you don't talk your teeth into liberal racism, then the difference between hard work under capitalism and hard work under socialism is as follows. First, the ideal of communism is creative, high-performance, non-exhausting, non-stultifying and non-dangerous work as a need for a healthy personality. Only such work becomes the most important condition for the mental and physical development of a person. The ideal of capitalism, that is, the bourgeoisie, is not some kind of labor, but production with constantly decreasing wage costs, the production of goods reduced to the production of surplus value expressed in profit. It is not difficult to imagine what kind of work is supposed in this case, the most dehumanized. Formalistic work is an appendage to the production process, whether it is agriculture, industry or services. Thus, the construction of communism in this aspect is synonymous with a victorious struggle to reduce the intensity, that is, tension, exhaustion and harmfulness, first of all, physical labor of direct producers, for increasing free time for the versatile development of each individual. Now even the most outspoken techno-skeptics have no doubt that the vast majority of monotonous, stultifying and difficult labor operations can easily be excluded from the production process at the expense of higher technology. Capitalists, on the other hand, use mechanization, computerization, and robotization of production only if it is personally beneficial to them. If it is more profitable to use manual labor of the lowest productivity and the most monstrous intensity, they forget about all the innovations, and the laws of capitalist production will never allow for exclusion of low productivity, high-intensity labor, to keep the mass of the proletariat in a state of the most primitive labor, to keep an army of the unemployed to establish wages at the level of survival, to keep the proletariat as a whole in poverty due to monthly price increases and credit bondage. These are the objective laws of wage labor, without which capitalism cannot function. Therefore, capitalism never implements a project of unpopulated production on the required scale, and all statements about this and local examples of high-tech production are dust in the eyes and a cheap deception. Moreover, scientific and technological progress under capitalism slows down the growth of labor productivity. Secondly, for the dictatorship of the working class involved in the still difficult, harmful, dangerous production, there is a brave band of brothers who must not only be protected and respected, but also surrounded with care, fighting for the destruction of the conditions of such work. And this is not only a political program of communist construction, but also a matter of honor for the socialist government. Whereas for the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, such workers are nobody, and for capitalists they are easily replaceable consumables. The historical transition from serfdom to wage labor, that is, from forced labor to voluntary labor, is considered the greatest achievement of capitalism. At first glance, this may seem paradoxical, but in fact, the worker in a capitalist society is attached to the master by a stronger bond than a slave by shackles, but by a serf whip. The strength of the discipline of slavery and serfdom was equal to the armed strength of the master, and the removal of his horsemen. The power of hunger discipline inherent in capitalism is truly all-encompassing. Capitalist property was formed on the basis of the usurpation of all modern means of production, turning a narrow circle of people into owners of all means of existence on Earth. Capitalism has long forced almost all people on the planet to depend directly and indirectly on the issue of physical survival on the wage labor of the subject himself or his closest relatives. Poverty, hunger, and credit bondage stand on the doorstep of every home and force billions of people every day to voluntarily go into service, sometimes in terms of disenfranchisement, baseness, and humiliation not inferior to slavery and serfdom. But liberals will forever continue to exalt the great right of the proletarian to freely change one master for another, to exalt and praise this capitalist regime. It is not yet known which is better, to sell muscle strength, being a low-paid worker mainly of physical labor, or to sell intellectual strength a little more expensive, being an intellectual, especially in creative and scientific professions, when conscience becomes part of the deal. In short, physical and mental prostitution is an organic feature of the self-hiring of a person to the owners. In recent years, especially in the West, the problem of turning female proletarian prostitution into ordinary prostitution has been increasingly discussed. Bourgeois Pharisees and feminists pretend that the causes of sexual coercion and humiliation of proletarians lie in the unfit upbringing of men, low morality of society, innate male lust and so on, in short, in anything but the omnipotence of capital, causing the omnipotence of the base passions of the owners and their closest servants. And in the meantime, all the oppressed and exploited classes in the history of human societies have always been forced. This is their exploitation to give to oppressors, firstly, their unpaid labor, and secondly, their women as concubines to the masters. Slavery, serfdom, and capitalism are the same in this regard. Only the form of exploitation changes, exploitation remains. Therefore, capitalist hiring is not only the exploitation of labor, but also the exploitation of our mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters as women, also under the guise of voluntary. And finally, the third factor preventing the realization of the existence and essence of exploitation is the desire of the proletarians, instilled by circumstances and fostered by propaganda, to maximize the reduction of free time by trying to earn more money. Market life is built by the dictatorship of the entrepreneurial class in such a way as to put a working person in unbearable conditions of underconsumption and constant striving to lengthen his working day. Those who are allowed to take recycling recycle, sometimes even without the legal surcharge. Those who are not allowed to recycle find a second or third job, get behind the wheel of a taxi, and so on. The means to form this aspiration are consumer loans, which have become a much more reliable incentive to slave labor than the ancient and medieval scourge. With diabolical cunning, panic is introduced into the consciousness of the proletarians in front of lack of money, debt pit, poverty, so that they voluntarily, by their personal choice, torture themselves in an effort to work even more intensively for the owner. Not even letting the class enemy raise his head is a tactic used by the bourgeoisie. The practice of wage labor monthly demonstrates to all thinking workers that it is the capitalists who determine how much of the produced social wealth they will allow the proletarians to consume. In part, this happens spontaneously, that is, each individual entrepreneur tries to optimize his expenses as much as possible and raise prices as much as possible. In part, this happens quite consciously. For example, the bourgeois government kindly calculates the physiological minimum of human survival, which the employer focuses on. Supply and demand in the labor market, which, according to liberals, should form a fair price for labor, are easily changed by the will of the bourgeoisie by state regulation of migration policy, the education system, demography, retirement age, taxation, and so on. But even if we assume an equilibrium of supply and demand in the labor market, it will only express the value of the commodity labor force, that is, the minimum necessary amount of money for the reproduction of the proletarian class. In other words, it is the same as in reality, but in a theoretical, speculative sense. The reason for this total economic dictatorship of owners is that they own all the means of production, have usurped all the factors of production of material and spiritual goods. In addition, they hold in their hands the entire commodity mass, in particular products of mass consumption, thus having an additional lever to reduce the real wage content by raising prices. Relatively speaking, today my salary is 75 kilograms of meat, and tomorrow it is 70 kilograms, while its monetary value has not changed, as well as the amount of working time. The monopoly of a microscopic part of society on the means of production turns into exploitation, for the vast majority of it. But when production becomes marketable, when an employee does not just serve the life and luxury of the owner with natural products and personal services, but turns into a means to accumulate monetary wealth, sucking out surplus value. The intensity of labor and the degree of exploitation acquire threatening proportions. Karl Marx wrote, "Capital did not invent surplus labor. Wherever a part of society has a monopoly on the means of production, the worker, free or unfree, must add to the working time necessary to maintain himself. Excessive working time in order to produce living resources for the owner of the means of production. Whether this owner is an Athenian aristocrat, an Etruscan theocrat, a Roman citizen, a Norman baron, an American slaveholder, a Wallachian boyar, a modern landlord or capitalist. However, it is clear that if in some socio-economic formation the predominant value is not the exchange value, but the use value of the product, then surplus labor is limited to a more or less narrow range of needs. But the unlimited need for surplus labor does not yet follow from the nature of production itself. Excessive labor in ancient times becomes terrible when it comes to extracting exchange value in its independent monetary form in the production of gold and silver. Forced labor, which kills an employee, is an official form of excessive labor here. However, these are exceptions for the ancient world. But as soon as the peoples whose production is still carried out in relatively low forms of slave, corvée labor, are involved in the world market, which is dominated by the capitalist mode of production and which makes the sale of the products of this production abroad the predominant interest, so to the barbaric horrors of slavery, serfdom, the civilized horror of excessive labor joins in. The system of measures and means of coercion to capitalist labor does not rely directly on physical violence, but is a kind of mental terror, both in the form of hunger discipline and in the form of tyrannical management principles, pressure, senseless control, unreasonable assignments, thoughtless planning, and the like. If any subjects have a desire to reorganize society or redistribute property, then the powerful apparatus of state coercion, consisting of the army, police, special services, prosecutors, courts, bailiffs, is included here, who should be considered rich exploiters who not only reap the fruits of their domination, but also make systematic efforts to preserve and entrench the economic and political order, as well as the spiritual dictates of their bourgeois ideology. Are they the same people as those whose hands produce all the public wealth? A working person and a person in general are synonyms. Physiological disability is similar to social death. Capitalism, on the other hand, makes idleness a dream, turns work into a curse, deliberately deprives able-bodied people of the opportunity to work, excludes young people who rage and old people who rot alive from social production. Capitalism turns all social relations into commodity money, destroys everything bright and sublime in human culture. Capitalism creates the ostentatious, bordering on madness, excesses of a microscopic minority and the need, deprivation, poverty, and oppression of the majority. Capitalism means inevitable wars, terror, crises, and catastrophes. And the executors, the clerks of the objective laws of the economy of capitalism, are persons who voluntarily constitute the bourgeois class, whose most monopolized state is called the oligarchy. A person can strive to become a builder, a miner, a doctor, a teacher, a scientist, an artist, a revolutionary, that is, one way or another, contribute to the development and prosperity of society with his life. In other words, mentally healthy people strive to learn and create, love and benefit society. But there is a class of people who only want the senseless appropriation of meaningless amounts of public wealth in the form of value. Happiness is unknown to them, because happiness and private property relations are incompatible. The meaning of life is unattainable to them, because it is directly related to the objective requirements of social progress, which they slow down. Such people develop animal atavisms of domination and cannibalism as makings. Such people are generated and nurtured by private property relations. Naturally, a significant part of such characters, in this absence of startup capital, are not able to realize their qualities in real life. Such unrealized capitalists are usually called Philistines or Philistines. Of course, the inherent characteristics of the bourgeois personality are not something immutable, forever established. They can be completely eradicated, replaced with truly human ones. For example, any person eradicates them, ceasing to think and live in a Philistine way, turning into a full-fledged creative person. The most reliable way to develop a person's personality to the level of the creator is the theoretical mastery of dialectics and guidance in their actions, in their activities, by Marxist truths, that is, inclusion in the struggle for the progress of mankind. The economic system of capitalism, the dominant type of industrial relations, is an objective relationship between people regarding the production, appropriation, exchange, distribution and consumption of material and spiritual living conditions in the form of deception and violence. Wage labor is one of the forms of production relations of capitalism. It is based on deception, which manifests itself in the appropriation by the owners of the means of production of the results of the producer's work in operation. To deny the existence of exploitation in modern society means to side with the dominant force, with the bourgeoisie.